I first found you, well, I've seen you a bunch of different places, but I first found you on ethical systems. And from there, I started kind of, listening to some of your speeches and following some of your work. There's way more of your work than I've been able to get through, but you really resonated with me as somebody who kind of looks at the world the same way. And I was just really excited to get you on here and kind of pick your brain a little bit, hear more about your background and kind of what you see for the future.
Well, when your colleague reached out, I had just watched your interview with Allison.
Oh,
and it was great. I mean, I love Allison. And given the book I'm writing now, I thought it seemed like a perfect conversation for us to have.
So let's just jump into that. Tell us a little bit about the book that you're working on and what drove you to write it.
Sure. So it's the result of a 15-year long. So we're live. We're doing this now. This is it. Okay. I assume you'll edit all that out. So the book is called "To Be Honest: Leading with the Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose," and it's the result of a 15-year longitudinal study with more than 3,200 leaders we interviewed to understand under what conditions would organizations promote or provoke honest and just behavior in people, and under what conditions would people choose to go to the dark side and behave dishonestly or withhold the truth or behave unfairly. We've examined this problem for many, many years as an issue of individual character or an issue of a couple of bad apples made a couple of bad choices. We see the Theranos story. We see the Volkswagen story as a bunch of corrupt R&D engineers afraid of not meeting their diesel quota. But 5,000 people didn't wake up at Wells Fargo all on the same morning and say, "Hey, here's an idea."
Right.
And I'm so tired of the behavioral science community bucketing it all under, well, it's the culture, because that just belies good organizational theory, and it's thin. So I wanted to understand, really, there must be more to the story than that. And so we used some great IBM Watson AI technology to read 3,200 transcripts to statistically examine and model. And what we found is that, in fact, there are provable conditions under which you can predict whether or not people will lie or tell the truth, whether they'll behave fairly or unfairly, whether they'll be forthcoming in information or whether they'll withhold the truth. And it was exciting because they're practical things that organizations can readily control.
So that's super interesting that there's some kind of formula that's going to kind of increase the likelihood for these behaviors to occur. I want to, before we dive into that, I'd like to go back to, you said that it's kind of thin to just attribute it to culture. So can you tell me some more, what you mean by that?
Well, first of all, there's so many misunderstandings of what culture is. Is culture the values that we put on the wall? Is culture the mood or the morale of the place? Is culture, we have the anthropologist version of it's the way things are done around here. Culture is when the new employee gets taken out in the parking lot, after orientation and tell people, okay, this is how stuff really works around here. That's culture. And we've had the behavioral science and organizational science debate for 40 years about, is culture a means or an end? Well, it's both. It is something you shape. It is a lever you pull to shape performance. It is not just the sum total of the values you define it by, but the gap between the values you define for a culture and what actually happens in practice actually is a measurable part of your culture. And so if you're not willing to look at that gap and understand what are the levers that shape behavior, there are information levers that shape behavior. There are resource allocation levers that shape behavior. There are reward systems that shape behavior. There are governance systems that shape behavior. There are training and development and selection and reward and hiring and firing systems that shape. There are a lot of things that shape the behavior of an organization. The question is, have you built them to shape the behavior you want? And does that behavior match what you say you want? And when it doesn't, are you going to be honest about that gap? So if you say you want collaboration, but all of your reward systems promote individual performance, if you say you want teaming and open and transparency, but your governance systems create access to information for only an elite hierarchical few, you have duplicity. So what are you willing to do with the espoused values you claim are the values you need in your company to drive the performance and the purpose you say you serve? And when those values don't do that, or when there is a violation of those values, or when there's a clear gap between what people are doing and what your values say is required, do you look the other way? Or do you step in, and is there consequences for that? Because the minute your values become a volunteer program, they're no longer considered valuable anymore.
So this gap, this duplicity that you're talking about, part of the challenge, I'd imagine, and you maybe saw this in your research and in your work, part of the challenge is maybe that feedback loop. And it's not maybe always that someone is seeing that there's this duplicity in place and they're just not doing something about it. They might not ever even find out about it because it's happening in little pockets.
Well, what's so funny though is that, and the people who could do something about it are the ones most blind. It's people at the top.
Yeah, right.
So the reality is that, in fact, that was one of the major findings in the research. We call this strategic identity crisis. When there's a gap between who you say you are, so your vision, your mission, your purpose, your values, your brand promises, all the statements you make about yourself, all the behavioral claims you make to be true about your company. When there's a gap between who you say you are and what you actually do, you're 3 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth.
Wow.
And when you are aligned in those things, when people actually experience, and not perfectly, but for the most part, that your actions and your words match, you're 3 times more likely to have people tell you the truth and behave justly and fairly.
Got it. So it kind of ends up in some way turning into kind of a perpetual motion machine on either one of these avenues, where on one side, if the deeds follow the words, the likelihood of someone speaking up in a candid way to say, hey, something's off track here, helps to preserve that sort of closeness or that lack of duplicity at a kind of a macro level, versus the other way, it ends up kind of turning into a wedge between these two sort of sides of the land that widens that chasm further and further.
Well, and you're absolutely right. It is self-reinforcing, because once duplicity becomes the norm, everybody in the organization then concludes, well, I guess around here we say one thing and do another. And to your point about the feedback loop, Neil, my question to all the CEOs and executives I work with is, how often do you sit around in your meetings and pull out your mission statement or pull out your values and say, hey, how are we doing? Where are we living by these things? Where are there gaps? How would we know if we were unintentionally failing to model these things? What feedback is in place for that? Many culture change efforts fail because they believe that the codification of the culture is the journey, and then it stops. The problem is then you take your values and you weaponize them, because now all those values are a screen for every employee to look up at you and say, here's all the ways you're not doing this, so why should I bother? And it becomes my excuse not to try. And so if you're not willing to say, okay, if we're going to embed these values in our strategy setting systems, in our reward systems, in our governance systems, in our feedback systems, in our selection systems, in our resource allocation and budgeting systems, if we're not going to make sure that these values are truly guiding the work and the productivity of our organization, then first of all, how important were they?
Yeah, right.
Were they just for cosmetic consumption externally, or did you really mean them? If you don't embed them and you just codify them and announce them in a beautiful branded campaign,
right?
You've institutionalized duplicity now, because now you've said, these are for show.
So, wow, there's a lot in there. So part of, I think, any value system is the aspirational nature of it, right? Like, we all know on an individual basis that perfection is not possible, yet if you're a top performer, you strive for perfection anyways, because the pursuit of it in itself is of value. At some level, integrity, for example, is implicit in everyone's value system. No one would say that, no, I don't care about integrity. So what do we do with the sort of inherent shortfall that's always going to incur between the codified, as you put it, values on the wall and the behaviors, while well-intentioned, that aren't living up to it? And how does that sort of gap of, at its core, is kind of duplicity. What do we do with that?
It's a fabulous question, though. Here's the thing. I think we have to be honest about the difference between aspirational and fictional.
Okay.
Aspirational means it's active. We're aspiring to it. But that doesn't mean we don't talk about the gaps. It doesn't mean we don't discuss the fact that there's still more room to go. And if there is always more room to go, that means that's an active, ongoing effort. So we should talk about it. We should talk about, where are we falling short? What is the next frontier of our integrity or our inclusion or our innovation or whatever we say we value. It's when you stop talking about it that the gap becomes a secret, becomes shameful, it becomes weaponized. And the employees, the only thing they can conclude is that you must know about the gap. Surely you recognize that that behavior, that statement, that decision, that investment just grossly violated this value or this promise. So you must have done it on purpose. Therefore, if you did it on purpose, it must be that you don't care about this. That none of that may be true, but that is the only conclusion that the employees and rank and file and your customers and your shareholders are going to draw. The alternative is worse. The alternative is you're stupid. You're so ignorant and so blind to what you just did and so unaware that you must be an idiot. So either way, you're dead, right? So people give you the benefit of the doubt by assuming you're aware that you did it. And
they assume you're not an idiot, to your point.
Right. Yeah. And so therefore, it must be that you're manipulative, that you're wanting me to believe something about you that's not true. So it's a do as I say, but not as I do prescription, which for me is like, well, no. If you're going to institutionalize hypocrisy as part of our everyday life, then I get the game now. The game is to make it look like I'm living by that value, but I compromise it when I have to.
So to your point, then it just kind of comes down to communication. It comes down to like, I love the title of your book because it's about being honest with ourselves about our own behaviors from a leadership perspective. And it comes down to us talking about these things all the time so that they don't just end up on the wall, but they actually live in our shared spaces and the words that are filling those spaces as we're talking about and reinforcing these values on a day-to-day basis. That's really the only way to not fall into this, what did you call it? A strategic identity crisis, which we see. It's almost like there's a strategic identity crisis across all organizations, because most organizations, I would say, here, I'll go ahead and say it, the values on the page are just kind of a joke. It just checks the box of us having a mission and a value statement, but very few that I've experienced, organizations I've experienced, are they actually doing what you're talking about, bringing that up off the wall, living it out every day, and trying to move from fictional to aspirational.
It's and I call the process embedding them. Have you done the design work, the systems work to embed the promises, brand promises? Radio Shack, forever promised you have questions, we have answers. Have you ever heard of anybody walking into Radio Shack when they were still open and getting a question answered from the person behind the counter?
No.
You were lucky if they even knew where the batteries were.
Good point.
Avis, we try harder. Well, how hard do you try when you're at the bottom of the J.D. Powers customer service satisfaction, consistently? How hard are you really trying? So we campaign our way into our promises. We make our mission, vision, values, and now the latest frontier of that is purpose washing, right? We're all trying to look like we're having a purpose, and you have all the campaigner marketers saying, no, purpose and mission are different. So now we have to have a vision, mission, values, and purpose statement. So the goal is to make it look like we're serving a bigger cause, giving to charities, looking like we're committed to social responsibility and all the other things that make us look like a responsible brand. But again, if your people can't locate their own sense of purpose in your purpose, if you're not living out your purpose in a way that invites people to live out theirs, duplicity. So, and that was just one of our findings, right? So the cumulative factors get better as you look at what other things predict. Consistency between your actions and words is just one of them. Accountability was another. So if your accountability systems, meaning the way you measure, not reward, not pay for, but measure contributions. So in other words, if I'm your boss, if you believe that the way we talk about the work you do and the contribution you make is fair, it's just, there's justice in it, and you trust that it's just, you are 4 times more likely to behave justly and tell me the truth. But if you believe that it's not fair, that the system is rigged, that the forced quota box put you on the out, but some other factor besides the merit of your work was considered in my evaluation of your work, you are 4 times more likely to lie, embellish your contributions, withhold your mistakes, because you think there's no justice in it.
So I want to get into this accountability piece because I think that's one of our main, in our organization, that's one of our main 3 values. And a lot of what you said resonates with me And you almost sort of articulated this sort of unspoken thing that I haven't even been able to say why it's an important value for us. But before we get into it, like what I've noticed is on both of these things that we've talked about, we've talked about two aspects of the research or the findings. It's kind of interesting that in both cases, on the positive and the negative, like there's no net zero. It's like 3x more or 3x less, or 3x more or 4x less. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no middle ground.
Yeah,
It's
but so
separator.
the great news is, Nick, that there actually was, right?
Oh.
So what the statistical models tell us that, to your point earlier, we don't have to have perfection. So if you improve the perception of fairness and accountability, or if you improve the gap between words and actions in your identity. So for example, if you improve strategic clarity by 35%, you raise truth telling and just behavior by 15%.
Okay.
So
together. Yeah.
Yeah. So to your point about aspirational, it isn't all or nothing. We can move the needle. But I think the other point you make is very important. You can move the needle in both directions.
Right.
So the further away from that alignment, the further away from that justice you veer, the more you are putting yourself at risk for the ethical fungus in the petri dish of what happened at Wells Fargo began to grow in that petri dish years before the first person sold that, that first false account. The fungus is growing in all the gaps. The fungus between who you say you are and what you do, accountability, the other two are governance and collaboration. It's all there. The cracks are there. So to assume they're not there just means you're just in denial. The question becomes, what are you willing to do about it?
Right. And why do you think, so let's talk about, like, at kind of the core, we're talking about authenticity, right? We're talking about these words that we say, do our deeds follow them in an authentic way? Or do these words sort of authentically describe our deeds that people are actually experiencing and feeling? Why do organizations, you think, allow, just for lack of a better term, marketing to campaign them toward a purpose that's not really resonant and not really true? Why do they miss this authenticity piece so much?
It's such a great question. What I wonder is, because when I sit in the C-suite with executives that I work with, they're good-hearted men and women. They're well-intended. So I think your very first point, I think, was important. I don't think people intentionally are trying to, rope-a-dope people and fool them into thinking, this is all sleight of hand. There are some of those. But I just think people make so many assumptions about people's good intentions, how aligned people are with how they read your mind and assume what you're doing is well-intended, how much people are just are going to align their behaviors behind you because you're a good person. And I think they don't understand that when your organization scales, it fragments. When, as you get to 100, 200, 500, 10,000, 30,000 employees, the lost in translation aspect of a campaign is deadly. And so the idea that you can communicate, I love when people, I heard a CEO a year ago say, I want to drive purpose down through the organization. I'm like, how are you going to do that? As if it were possible.
Right.
I don't think leaders understand that these promises have to be chosen. Yeah. You don't get to drive them through the organization. You don't get to prescribe them and dictate them and give people a values vaccine, or give everybody the annual values flu shot.
Right.
Like every year we sign the ethical code of conduct, or we get our annual diversity training. It's like our annual flu shot. Right. It doesn't work like that, right? If you believe in these things, and you believe in them because you believe they're good for your organization and they're good for how you compete. It's okay for them to drive performance. That's what they should do. It's not a social club. It is an enterprise, and they have to be able to correlate. If the values can't be correlated to the performance you've committed to, don't have them. You have to be able to prove that they correlate. But when they do, you have to actually. It's like how many times have you heard somebody, let's say they're scores of pounds overweight, I'm going to lose weight. And the next day they say, I ate carrots all day, nothing happened. And they're seriously frustrated. Like, they thought that eating carrots for a day was going to have some, and you're looking at them like, well, really? So when I hear executives say, we did a values rollout, we did a campaign, everybody got a handbook, I did videos. and you're still seeing bad behavior. And you hear like they really believed that all that, those 3-hour training programs.
Yeah,
that
it
they
was
sprinkle pixie dust.
videos were well lit. We had a guy help us with the script.
They were expensive. We did interviews with employees. You contrast it with what, for example, Microsoft, what Sadia and Kathleen are doing at Microsoft. I mean, they are embedding that culture. It's taking years and years. They are doing the deeper work to truly shape that culture because they understand what it takes. I think the problem is that when we codify and prescribe a set of behaviors and assume that that's the end of the journey, we just set people up for disappointment and failure. And the problem is you've raised hope. You've raised the hope that people will want to change and that change is possible. The other problem is that when people codify behaviors, when they prescribe a set of behaviors that are meant to be corrective. So integrity becomes a value when there's been a scandal. Inclusion becomes a value when there's been too many lawsuits for discrimination. Innovation becomes a value when we're suddenly lagging to market. When you start prescribing values that are meant to fix people, you can be sure that the last thing that's going to happen is people want to be fixed. So you have to understand what's your motivation for codification in the first place. I think your other point earlier is a really important one. It's to check our box off we have those. You have to just stop. It's 2020. People are going to see through that crap. In fact, today they expect it to be a ruse, right? So if you actually are going to be credible and you really do want people to believe that you intend to live by what you say, you have to work 4 times as hard just because people already start with their eyes rolling.
Yeah, because they've been so jaded by it. I think when they first came out, it's like, oh, this is a purpose statement. Oh, wow, this is sort of listing all these values that we want to espouse, and these are phenomenal. But as you've worked in 5 different organizations, and there's 80% overlap between these same things, and you see the same sort of bad behaviors, you're like, okay, this is more of the same crap that I've already heard before.
I know the drill. Looks like you got them off of Google values. And so I think you'd be better off not doing anything. I tell my clients all the time, whenever we do strategy work, where we're really truly reshaping strategy, and then everybody wants to go to the mission vision. I'm like, the mission vision values don't actually have a strategy, actually have a real competitive identity about what makes you different. Actually do that work. A year from now, earn your right to write down the values because you will have lived them for a whole year. Don't write. If you write them down now, they're going to be DOA. The minute they're on the wall, they're like dead. So don't write down any culture. Listen to your organization tell you what the values are. Listen to the values that shape performance. Listen to the choices, the statements, the promises, the aspirations of people that are actually driving your strategy. Watch people, honor that, live by it. Then you've earned your right to write it down because you have already embodied it.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the only way it's going to be to really embed it, the only way you're going to be able to avoid the eye roll is if everybody buys into it. And to your point, you can't drive that. Like, you can't bang a gavel and say, these are our values. By edict, I decree, have the town crier yell out 5 different values.
Sorry about that.
That's right.
And yet, what's so funny? That's exactly what people do. I love the gavel metaphor. Why do people do it? I'm always baffled by that. They somehow they think the edict works, and I'm often like, these are good people. They're smart.
They're not idiots.
They somehow believe that I've banged the gavel. I banged the gavel. I made an edict. I must mean it. And if I do genuinely mean it, and I think on some level they really do, why wouldn't it work?
Yeah, and I think so. This is something that somebody told me, me and my brother, when we came into the company that we're at, and they said, if you're dating a girl who had been cheated on before or who had been abused before, you have to work kind of to what you were saying. You're gonna have to work extra hard to build that trust. And while those weren't like your sins that you're sort of paying for, you still have to pay for them if you want that bridge built and them to even open their eyes to the possibility that, is this not just a bunch more sort of Googled values on the wall?
Yeah. And I think there's all kinds of organizational PTSD out there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I think that people don't realize you're stepping into a history, a story. And if you don't realize that there's a story before you, and if you don't understand that that history is shaping people's perception of you, that perception is shaping people's understanding of you, or there's trauma literally in their amygdala that's looking at you as the last boyfriend, that's looking at you as the last boss, or their gym teacher from 7th grade.
Right.
And you're reliving a story. If you can't recognize that, you're going to keep tap dancing in the minefield.
Yeah, and then I think it ends up, you start kind of getting a kind of like a type 2 error, because you think like, well, this field just can't grow anything. You know, you kind of get this false negative where you're just like, you know, they're just not going to take to these values, when actually you needed to just spend a little bit of extra time living them out to prove it.
Well, and I think that then you're just breeding cynicism, right? If you just allow that to proliferate, people's beginning cynicism, and sometimes even their fatalism, just proliferates, and you give them no disconfirming data to stop, right? And without doing that, all of your duplicitous behavior, intentional or not, is just reinforcing their cynicism, and giving them reason to opt out, right? So then it's not that your best people quit and leave, it's that your mediocre people quit and stay.
Yeah. And then that cynicism, which is sort of the core of that disengagement, which shows up as mediocrity, is able to like proliferate the organization to an even greater extent.
Like a bad rash.
Right.
Like a bad rash.
So, what's kind of interesting, though, is like we're talking a lot about really human nature just on an organizational scale. And we have a lot of these folks at the top of an organization, so to speak, who are trying to affect a culture, and they're trying to drive these things. And again, this is broad brushstrokes, but usually when you get to that level in an organization, you have some kind of salesmanship bone that or some kind of salesmanship muscle that you've been able to build. And that's sort of based in an understanding of human nature. Mm-hmm. And they can sell the board on an idea, or they can sell, a partner on a new, business opportunity or something. Why does it break down? Why does this is what it seems like. Why does this understanding of human nature seem to break down when we're talking about a whole crowd or a group of people, where on a one-to-one basis, they could probably convince that person that, hey, I'm really sincere about these new values that we're pushing out?
Well, you have to, I think, so let's go back to the bad girlfriend metaphor. Now you've got thousands of bad breakups, right? So there's thousands of stories you're trying to penetrate. There are thousands of narratives through which this is being interpreted. There are proliferated cognitive biases. So the filters your message have to get through are impossibly endless, which means you as the executive trying to be the ambassador of the values, by definition, are woefully inadequate.
Right.
Which means if your top 100, 400 executives and leaders, depending on how big your organization is, are not equally as invested, equally as committed to modeling, equally humble about their own gaps, if they are not leading conversations in all of their meetings about how their team wants to operate, inviting people's voices to the table, actually giving people chances to model the values for themselves.
Right.
Giving people the tools, the training, the coaching, and the resources, the access to information, the participation in governance, the ability to cross borders safely in the organization, the chance to tell their story and their own purpose and align it to the mission. I mean, one of the greatest ways Satya embedded purpose at Microsoft was to say to people, you don't work for Microsoft, make Microsoft work for you. You have a purpose in the world. How does Microsoft serve your purpose in the world? And he completely flipped the script.
Right.
And of course, what they're doing there now is extraordinary, because everybody's looking for ways to live their own embodied purpose in the world with Microsoft as the platform. And that's not a trivial platform.
Right.
And so what if everybody invited people to say, tell me the story you feel like you were born to live, and how does being part of this organization fuel the embodiment of that story? What a very different script. And then not just say that, we want you to have a purpose, but actually talk about it. Make sure the workers align to it. Fix it when it's broken.
Well, it's so funny to frame it the way that you just framed it, because especially when you put it in contrast to that sort of, stereotype you said before of, I'm going to drive purpose down. Because what they're really doing is they're pulling the purpose out. And they're, you know what I'm saying? They're letting people release their purpose and use it, like you said, use the organization as a platform for them to live out this thing that they were meant to do.
Purpose is excavated. it's not delivered.
Yes.
And they spent 9-10 months just on listening tours, listening to thousands and thousands of employees. They had experts. They studied. They really thought about, when Satya said, I'm going to rediscover the soul of Microsoft, he really went looking for it to rediscover it. He didn't layer over like bad wallpaper in a bad house, another layer of wallpaper on top of the old wallpaper. He stripped the walls, kept what was beautiful about Microsoft, kept the incredible technological innovation, the commitment to productivity, the commitment to great tools. He preserved the beauty of Microsoft's origins, but then extended the story to restore the part of the soul they had lost, and was honest about it. Right. He didn't try and shy away from the fact that they had lost their way.
Yeah, and I think approaching it with that both, authenticity and humility allows people to engage in a deeper level, to let them be more candid about it and really talk about where those things are missing. And I think
now I trust you.
Yeah, and I think part of what allowed him to do that is that longer term view he took to it. This isn't like, okay, in Q2 we're going to roll out our new purpose statement, and by Q3's investor call, you know what I'm saying?
But you didn't just make that quip up, right? How many executives have said in Q2 we're going to roll out the values? You just have to wonder why there was not, what chip is missing that didn't go whoop whoop whoop. You just said you're going to be the Pope by Q4. You just made a delusional promise to people,
right?
And you think people bought it. That's what's even worse.
So I'm just, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about how in like recorded history, I don't think there's been as many like large companies as there are now. And I don't think that there's been a sort of recent, like a level of labor mobility as there's been now, which has allowed for sort of all these other sort of, this multiplication of interactions and opportunities for people to get jaded. And, you said this quote earlier, which I just freaking love. You said, when your organization scales, it fragments. So we really have these massive organizations that are full of sort of, PTSD victims or whatever you want to call them, who have had these bad experiences that are jaded and everywhere. Is it an insurmountable task for organizations at large to kind of fix some of the things that we're talking about? Or on the other hand, do you feel like it's more an opportunity for those who see the opportunity in it to kind of do this Microsoft approach? Like, talk to me a little bit about like where you see this going.
Well, so I think it's, in my research for the book, I'm looking at a lot of B Corp companies that have scaled, because I think we can learn a lot from them. One of the laments I hear from a lot of established company executives is, well, that was easy for them. They were born that way. And I'm like, well, maybe. But look at Skanska in Sweden. There are companies who have had to depart from dark roots and turn around. Microsoft's another great example. I think it has to be the will of the executive to do it. So interestingly, you talk about the fragmentation and the lack of cohesion across an organization. One of the findings in the research was about border wars. So silos, we all have them in our company. But if your company is fragmented, right? Once you fragment the organization, you fragment the truth. So now we have dueling truths, my way versus your way. When organization silos have created unresolved conflicts at their seams, and the seams are not stitched well, this was probably the most surprising finding in our research, you're 6 times more likely to have people lie or withhold the truth or behave unjustly.
Wow.
6 times. Because we spend so much time trying to get across borders. None of the value our organizations create for the marketplace is created in any one part of it. It takes the blending of capabilities, right? Innovation just isn't R&D. Innovation is marketing, R&D, consumer insights, sales, and operations. Well, if I'm an executive, I just care about innovation. Have I created the bridges across those seams to create the cohesion needed? Once people are enrolled in a story bigger than their own, I actually feel part of a story bigger than my own. I care about how those people succeeded. I care about how I contribute to the success of somebody else. They're not just, them. But if, for example, let's take digital marketing. In one digital marketing department, I have people who are rewarded on traffic, and that's what they're measured on. It's a KPI. In the social part of it, they're measured on conversion. I just institutionalized a border war between 2 parts of my marketing group who I'm asking to drive revenue to be rivals and not share data.
So How?
So it's not about an interpersonal, they don't get along well. Let's do team building.
Yeah.
I've designed them to fight.
Right.
So if I'm not willing to go embed a set of metrics and a set of work practices that allow the cohesion to happen, and I've prevented them from being part of a bigger story, I'm now imposing fragmentation. I'm imposing rivalry. So now they have to lie.
It.
They have to lie about each other. They have to tell the truth. They have to withhold information. They have to behave unfairly to win.
Yeah, how crazy is that? Just to
People, how many times, if you sales and marketing, operations and finance, operations and R&D, logistics and supply chain, you look at any set of seams in the organization where the capabilities are meant to come together to deliver greater value, where the governance processes, the metrics, the reward systems,
right,
the strategy setting process. I have one client right now who sets their strategy. They're a $4 billion, very successful company. It's the total bottoms-up approach. So everybody cascades up their strategy, hands it in, the CEO staples it together, it's a strategy. Nobody is looking across the organization to see, well, who's committed to what. So I may have as my number one priority doing limited time offerings on pricing for my one customer segment.
Right.
That requires marketing, sales, a certain type of manufacturing for small batch offerings. Did I go to those people and say, hey, you're on my plan as my number one priority? We're on their plan, that may be a number 4 priority or maybe no priority.
Right.
You know, when we find that out, in the quarter, I go and actually execute it.
Right.
And then I'm looking at, and so all the commitments we've made on our performance are baked into wars you've set to go off.
Yeah.
Why would you not know? Dell Compute has a great process. They built their strategy, cascaded up, and then they cascade it down. And for that one client I talked about, we're actually now in the process of rebuilding strategy, so it cascades down, but it also cascades across. So
right.
No strategy is ratified till everybody's commitments have been ratified. If I've made a promise that you have to help me keep, you know about it.
And you bought into it.
Or you've said no, in which case we renegotiate it. And it's all, so that's what gets handed in to the CEO.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with great intention. So what was the bottom up about? I want people to feel included. I want them to feel part of the strategy. I want to hear their voice.
Ownership for their goals.
Yeah. So with the best of intentions, I built a strategy designed to fail.
Yeah, and then you're scratching your head like, why is this not working? It's chaos.
Yeah. So what does the CEO? I should just do it myself. Screw empowerment. It didn't work. That's actually not what happened.
Right.
But that set of executives had the smarts to let us come in and diagnose and say, what's going on here? We excavated up and we talked to, we have a really forensic diagnostic process that we use in our organizations that gets at what's really going on systemically to say, you built in commitments you couldn't keep. So don't rescind the commitments, build in what it takes to keep the commitments you make. Finish the work.
So talk to me a little bit about your consulting practice. I'd love to hear about how you got into this game, but maybe first we can talk about like your ideal scenario. If you could sort of sketch out and say, here's a perfect example, sort of company size or the types of issues, or maybe it's new leadership or something. And what does that look like? You come in, you do some kind of diagnosis. How long does that engagement take? What's the follow-on piece? Like, what is that shape? What's the shape of it?
All of our clients are executives, C-suite executives, division presidents, some senior leader who has either self-mandated or been handed a mandate for some type of really significant transformation. It could be opportunistic. They're trying to grow, they're trying to merge, they're trying to expand into some market, or it could be reparative. They're in a ditch, or they're careening into a ditch and they're trying to prevent it. It could be a crisis of strategic identity, meaning their competitive status has changed by their own choice or not by their own choice. And so what they're claiming to be versus who's actually paying them money, there's a gap. We need to find out why. There's an organizational ditch. An organization, I don't mean the structure, I mean the entire system, hardware, software, culture, people, process, governance, structure, is no longer aligned to the strategy. So it was built in a time that was intended to deliver a very different strategy. And now it's just on autopilot, but it's breaking down as it's been asked to do way more than it's capable of doing. Or it's a leadership crisis. The people leading the organization are not not equipped to lead in a way that is required by this. So strategy, organization, leadership, some combination of those three places, we have a problem or we have an opportunity. We come in and we take a very systemic look at ours. So we do really forensic interviews. Like we extract insights, data, profound anxieties, all kinds of stuff. We become objects of transference to sort of get all that out. And do a very analytical look, coding of the data. Some of that's done by technology, some of it's done by analysts and coders. But what we put back in front of clients is the entirety of their story. So they get back 60, 70, 80, 90 pages of everything we heard, carefully scripted into the story the organization is telling itself. Everything we heard, they heard, but it's scripted around a system story. This is a story people are telling themselves about the strategy, the culture, the capabilities, their bosses, you as a leader.
How eye-opening is that document for guys?
It's profoundly disturbing in that they have access.
It's probably the worst.
Because I'm ripping scabs off, right? I'm putting in front of them a mirror they would never have access to. Right. They're going to hear voices and sentiments and candor that they would never able to hear on their own.
Mm-hmm.
I put it back in front of the whole organization. So everybody involved gets to read it. You don't know who said what, but you know that it was said. You know where there's alignment. You know where there's differences. You know where there are competing points of view. You know where people are naming the pain points. You know when people are naming you as a pain point. Now the question is, this is the story you are in. You understood one part of this story. Now together you now share the understanding of the entire story. Ice cold water though it may feel like.
Right.
Now the great news is you get to write a shared next story. What is the next chapter of a story going to look like? You get to write. First, you have to make sense of this story. You have to be honest about this story.
Yeah, where are we really at right now?
And how did we get here?
Right.
And what is your contribution to getting here? And what of where you are is a surprise or not? Now, most leaders will say, I wasn't surprised at any of it. And then my question is, well, if you knew about it, then why didn't you do something about it?
Exactly.
And a lot of times, I think you made this point earlier, Nick, a lot of times they're doing things they believe are intended to get after the problems. They're just doing the wrong things.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a hard thing many times to hear some of that stuff because, man, I'm trying so hard and like these roots are still out there. I'm sure
you're pulling your favorite lever instead of the right lever. And
how important is that piece of the puzzle where you share that document with everybody?
It is the galvanizing moment for change, right? Because if most people hire consultants to come in and tell me the answer, come in and tell me what to do. And the problem then, of course, is you don't own the answer. Right? It's just the consultant's answer. So we always come in with here's our take on your story. Here's what we believe the story is telling you. But I will not do that till you and your executives have spent a day and a half in a room deep in that conversation, talking to each other, talking honestly, sharing your views, sharing your own fears, sharing your own pain about what that story is saying and what you believe the story means. When you've done that, then you've earned your right to hear what I think.
So that's we all say, reality is our friend, give it to me straight. And then you get a 90-page document that kind of shows your ineptitude at some level, right?
Well, it shows what we say, here's what you're good at, right? Now, diagnoses by their nature are meant to be, looking for opportunities. Right. So documents always feel skewed toward the opportunity side versus the here's why you're great side.
Right.
But the reality is, until you can be honest about where you're at, anything you craft for next is going to be fictional. So starting from a galvanized place of honest conversation about this is the story we find ourselves in, this is what, 30, 40, 50 of our people, are shaping their choices around. If we want the story to be different, or we want to take what's good and build on it for next, what has to happen now? And then I can tell you from a strategic articulation point of view, from an organizational capability point of view, from a leadership point of view, what it's going to require. Now, if there's something like some scientific or technical requirement, go get that. That's not mine to help you with, but you need to get it. So I'll accompany you on that journey by helping you design the organization, by helping you really understand strategically what you're capable of and what you should be saying to the market or about your competitors or to those you want to pay you money. I can tell you how to build governance processes that actually get you the decision-making you want. One client of mine right now, we've been doing work there for years, and governance continues to come up as a major, because it's a scientific organization where governance is moving assets through a pipeline to a market that are very complex and scientific. They've been tweaking governance obsessively, but they've been tweaking is the hardware. the structure, the decision rights, the charters, the cadences.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the software. They're putting in software. It's like trying to run Windows 2000 on a current, Dell. It just is all over. So you have misunderstandings of what empowerment means. In this culture, empowerment means I get my way. And if I don't get my way, I wasn't empowered. Inclusion means you agree with me versus you heard me.
Right.
So you have these very immature, in very complicated decision processes where assets are moving through a pipeline at in complicated, expensive ways. Mm. You have expectations of people that are misaligned to what the software is capable of producing. So the issue is don't keep tweaking the hardware, fix the software. And so what I hear, we tried that. We announced empowerment. You campaigned. You campaigned for inclusion. You campaigned for open, honest debate. Did you think you would just sprinkle that on people that were going to suddenly open their mouth and be debate?
Yeah, right.
When they walked into the governance meeting and presented their case, and you yelled at them and shamed them and told them they were idiots? How open do you think they're going to be next time? Right. So if you want the governance to work, you have to put in software that it'll run on. So this time around, we're saying, let's not tweak the hardware anymore. I mean, you have a couple of places it could be better, but for the most part, it's fine. But the behavioral set you're encoding in that is completely misaligned to what you've asked for it to do. And you keep wondering why the behaviors don't get produced. So we help then go do the work to repair what the diagnosis has found. We call it the organizational MRI. We do a deep MRI, and now we know where to go cut in.
Yeah, it's so interesting because all this stuff we're talking about, this sort of organizational structure stuff, or, it's just the thing that kept coming back to me throughout this conversation is there's well-intended people at the top who see some need for change. They bring you in, they're like, hey, we need some help with this. You give them this document and it's well beyond what they sort of thought it was going to be. Or you see them sort of trying to sort of weed the garden and they're pulling flowers instead, or they're pulling the wrong levers, or whatever analogy you want to use. This understanding of the system and really understanding what you're trying to drive at and how to really do that embedded work to take those things off the wall and actually help folks live them out. It's just such a difficult process. I want to be conscious of time here. In our last couple of minutes, let's talk about somebody, the whole purpose of this podcast, The Ethics Experts, is to help elevate ethics and compliance professionals who often get kind of embedded into these cost center pigeonholes. And they, in my opinion, are the folks who can really help drive a lot of the things that we're talking about, because they wrap around all aspects of the organization. And if we can just unleash them, they can drive a lot of good and a lot of that bottom line expansion, which those sort of dollar myopic people at the top are really trying to drive toward, right?
So I love my ethics friends. I actually did a bunch of conferences last year in the ethics community for my ethics friends, did a bunch of conference board conversations with them. I spent a lot of time at Ethical Systems on their advisory board working with them. John Hyde is actually writing the foreword to my book.
Oh, cool.
So I love him. Here's my plea to the ethics community. I know you're used to being the folks that are seen as the cops, and you don't like that. You don't like feeling marginalized in your voice. You do want to make a difference. Trust me when I tell you that if you reported to the board instead of the chief legal counsel, it wouldn't change a thing. Because the distribution channel for the behavior you are trying to produce is not the ethics and compliance policy book. If you are not best friends with the head of HR, the CFO, and the head of strategy, and the four of you together, because the behaviors you want shaped, you don't control.
Yep.
The head of strategy owns the processes that allocate resources and set direction. The head of finance owns budgeting and resource allocation. The head of HR owns selection, rewards, promotions, and assessment. Those are the major levers that are shaping the behavior. They're your distribution channel. And I can't tell you, Nick, how many CISOs I've asked what your relationship was like with them. Some of them didn't even know their names.
Yeah, I know.
I think I've met the CFO or the strategy guy. He started last year. His name is. So I think the migration of the CISO out of you're the cops that keep people out of jail. You fix the lawsuits. Your risk prevention to the behavioral experts that shape cultures of integrity, honesty, and purpose. It's a big migration path. Some of them aren't wired to do it. God bless them. But I think many of them are. And I think they just don't understand that they have to build those partnerships. Last year we did a couple of great conference board conversations with the ethics community and we made the HR folks come in. So we brought the HR and the ethics folks together and said, now talk to each other. Now the problem is you have HR folks who feel just as marginalized as the ethics folks. So that now you have this territoriality issue of it's mine.
Mhm.
Why are you doing the investigation? It's my investigation. Guys, if you're fighting over whose investigation is, or you don't want the investigation, you do it. You're really missing the point.
Exactly.
Because together, the four of those people disproportionately control the behavior of the organization in ways they don't understand. But until you put them in a room together to say, how are we setting direction? How are we choosing priorities? How are we choosing what to plan and what not to plan? How are we choosing where to set up our operations? Financially, how are we choosing what data to be transparent in our budgets? Who gets to decide what budgets and priorities get set? Who gets to allocate resources and control those dollar amounts? Who gets to hire and fire? And how do we do it? And on what criteria? Who gets to promote and reward? Who gets to train and develop and teach? Asking your HR person, could I have an hour of the management training week to do my ethics thing? Interesting. Could I write a sort of a set of bullets on setting ethical budgets for you to sort of distribute with the templates? Okay. I mean, those are baby starts. But the reality is when the four of you together say, how do we shape an organization that is integrity proof, that the fungus for scandal and misconduct is not only out of the petri dish, but the best behavior, the best ideas, the best innovations, and the most competitive strategies are actually coming out of our people. You're not the scandal avoidance cop, right? You are the person that brings the glue together between strategy, finance, and HR in ways that they won't do together. So you're like the little conductor of the quartet. Bring them together, invite them to lunch, get to know them, understand what's on their agenda, understand their processes, have conversations, invite them to collaborate. Don't be a pain in their butt and sort of, bang on the door and say, I need you, I need you, I need you. Don't be the nagging little brother. Build connectivity between them, and together, and then, say that over the next 2 or 3 years, you want to shift the organization's understanding of what you do, you need the three of them to do it.
And what you talked about, those four together affecting, which was behavior, ideas, and innovation, that is the lifeblood. Those are the table stakes in today's economy, which is not a bunch of machines. It's a bunch of people and doing knowledge work to drive the business forward.
Yep.
I love that. That's going to be a huge takeaway from this. I thank you so much, Ron. This was a really, I had a lot of fun. I'd love to chat with you again once I get a chance to read your book. It sounds really exciting. Is it out now?
It is. It will be out next spring.
Oh,
so,
next spring. Okay.
I'd love to come back on your show and talk about it when it's out.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Ron. It's an absolute pleasure. I learned a ton, had a blast with you. I feel like we could have gone another hour. But thank you so much for joining us on The Ethics Expert.